Elizabeth Taylor found her mother's hidden diary after the funeral. What she read on page 47 made her scream and throw the book across the room. That entry changed everything she believed about her life. The diary was hidden behind a false panel in Sara Taylor's bedroom closet, discovered 3 days after her funeral in September 1994. Elizabeth had been going through her mother's belongings, sorting through decades of memories and mementos, when she noticed something odd about the back wall of the closet. The wood panel seemed loose, almost deliberately concealed. Elizabeth Taylor was 62 years old, a Hollywood legend who thought she knew everything about her family's history. Her mother Sara had been her closest confidant, her protector during the brutal years of child stardom, her anchor throughout decades of scandals and triumphs. They had shared everything, or so Elizabeth believed. She was about to discover how wrong she had been. Behind that false panel was a leather-bound diary, worn from years of handling, filled with her mother's careful handwriting spanning from 1932 to 1992. 60 years of secrets, thoughts, and confessions that Sara Taylor had never shared with anyone, especially not with her famous daughter. Elizabeth carried the diary to her mother's bedroom and sat on the bed where Sara had spent her final days. She expected to find loving memories, perhaps some sentimental thoughts about Elizabeth's childhood or career. What she found instead would destroy every assumption she had about her life, her family, and the woman who had shaped her destiny. The early entries were innocent enough. Sara writing about her hopes for her beautiful daughter, her excitement about Elizabeth's first acting opportunities, her pride in watching her little girl become a star. But as Elizabeth read deeper into the diary, she began to notice a disturbing pattern in her mother's words. Entry after entry revealed that Sara Taylor had been making decisions about Elizabeth's life based not on what was best for her daughter, but on what would be most profitable, most advantageous for their family's social and financial status. Every career choice, every relationship, every major decision in Elizabeth's young life had been calculated and manipulated by a mother who saw her daughter as a commodity rather than a child. But the real shock was waiting on page 47, in an entry dated March 15, 1950. Elizabeth was 18 years old at the time, just beginning to establish herself as an adult actress, still naive about the darker aspects of Hollywood and still completely trusting of her mother's guidance. The entry began innocuously enough: Elizabeth is becoming more independent, asking more questions about her contracts and her money. She's starting to think for herself, which could become a problem. But then Sara's writing took a turn that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. I've made arrangements with Louis B. Mayer. Elizabeth doesn't know about the special contract provisions, the personal services clauses that go beyond her acting. She trusts me to handle her business affairs, and she never reads the fine print. It's better this way. She's too innocent to understand what's required of her to maintain her position in this industry. Elizabeth dropped the diary, her hands shaking as the implications of her mother's words sank in. Special contract provisions. Personal services clauses. What had her mother agreed to on her behalf without her knowledge? She forced herself to keep reading, even though every instinct told her to stop, to preserve whatever innocence she had left about her relationship with her mother. The next entries detailed arrangements that made Elizabeth feel physically sick. The dinner with Mr. Mayer went as planned. Elizabeth looked beautiful, acted charming, and didn't ask any uncomfortable questions. She still believes these are just business meetings. I've taught her to trust authority figures, to do what she's told without questioning. It makes everything so much easier. Sara's diary revealed that she had been orchestrating situations where Elizabeth, as a teenager, was placed in compromising positions with powerful men in the entertainment industry. Not for her daughter's career advancement, but for financial benefits and social connections that Sara craved for herself. Elizabeth earned us another $25,000 bonus this month. She doesn't know about the separate payments, of course. She thinks her salary is what it says on her main contract. The additional compensation for her special cooperation goes directly to our family account. She never questions why we can afford such nice things on her official salary. Elizabeth realized with growing horror that her mother had been essentially pimping her out to studio executives and influential Hollywood figures, using Elizabeth's beauty and naivety to secure financial and social advantages. And Elizabeth had been completely unaware, believing she was just attending business dinners and social events as part of her professional obligations. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. As Elizabeth continued reading through the diary, she found entries that revealed her mother's true feelings about her daughter's well-being, her happiness, and her future. The loving, protective mother Elizabeth remembered was revealed to be a calculating manipulator who saw her daughter's suffering as an acceptable price for their family's success. Elizabeth cried again tonight about the pressure, about feeling like she can't trust anyone in this industry. I told her it's just part of growing up, that she needs to be stronger. I can't let her become too emotional or too questioning. The arrangements I've made require her to be compliant and trusting. Her innocence is our greatest asset. Sara had deliberately kept Elizabeth naive and dependent, preventing her from developing the critical thinking skills that might have helped her recognize when she was being exploited. Every time Elizabeth had tried to assert independence or ask difficult questions, Sara had manipulated her back into compliance. I've spoken to Dr. Peterson about Elizabeth's increasing anxiety. He's agreed to prescribe something to help her stay calm during the more difficult business meetings. She trusts him completely, just like she trusts me. The medication will make her more agreeable and less likely to remember details that might upset her later. Elizabeth's lifelong struggles with prescription medication, which she had always attributed to physical pain and emotional stress, had actually begun as a deliberate strategy by her mother to keep her controllable and compliant. Sara had conspired with doctors to medicate her teenage daughter into submission. But perhaps the most heartbreaking entry came from 1952, when Elizabeth was 20 years old and beginning to show signs of rebellion against her mother's control. Elizabeth is asking too many questions about her finances, about the men she's required to spend time with, about why she feels so uncomfortable after certain business meetings. She's starting to piece things together, and that could ruin everything I've built for our family. I may need to take more drastic measures to maintain control. The drastic measures Sara referred to became clear in subsequent entries. She had begun spreading rumors about Elizabeth's mental stability, suggesting to studio executives and family friends that her daughter was becoming unstable and needed closer supervision. Sara had systematically destroyed Elizabeth's credibility and independence, making it impossible for her to challenge her mother's authority or seek help from others. Everyone now sees Elizabeth as fragile and unpredictable. They look to me to manage her, to make decisions for her well-being. This gives me complete control over her career and her personal life. She can't make any moves without my approval because no one else trusts her judgment. Elizabeth realized that many of the difficulties she had faced in her early adult relationships, the problems with trust and independence that had plagued her throughout her life, had been deliberately created by her mother to maintain psychological control over her. The diary entries continued chronologically, revealing how Sara had sabotaged Elizabeth's early romantic relationships whenever they threatened her control. She had fed negative information about Elizabeth's suitors to studio executives, spread gossip about Elizabeth's mental state to discourage serious romantic attachments, and manipulated her daughter's emotions to keep her dependent and isolated. Elizabeth is getting too close to Montgomery Clift. He encourages her to think for herself, to question the business arrangements I've made. I've spoken to his agent about concerns regarding his influence on Elizabeth's emotional stability. It may be necessary to limit their friendship. Sara Taylor had deliberately damaged Elizabeth's relationship with one of her closest friends because Montgomery Clift had encouraged Elizabeth to be more independent and questioning about her career management. The isolation Elizabeth felt throughout her life, the difficulty forming trusted relationships, had been orchestrated by the person she trusted most. But the cruelest entries dealt with Elizabeth's children and her attempts to be a better mother than Sara had been. Elizabeth is too soft with her children, too indulgent. She doesn't understand that children need to be shaped for success, molded to be useful. I try to correct her parenting mistakes when she's not around, to teach her children the same lessons I taught her about compliance and trust. Sara had been undermining Elizabeth's parenting, attempting to recreate the same cycle of manipulation and control with Elizabeth's children. The pattern of exploitation that had damaged Elizabeth was being passed down to the next generation, with Sara as the architect of their dysfunction. The diary revealed that Sara had been meeting secretly with Elizabeth's children, filling their heads with the same toxic ideas about compliance and trust that had destroyed Elizabeth's autonomy. She had been teaching Elizabeth's daughters that their mother was too emotional, too unstable to make good decisions for their family. Liza asked me today why her mother takes so many pills, why she seems sad even when she's supposed to be happy. I explained that Elizabeth has always been fragile, that she needs people like me to help her make the right choices. Liza is beginning to understand that she can't always trust her mother's judgment. Sara had been poisoning Elizabeth's relationship with her own children, just as she had poisoned every other meaningful relationship in Elizabeth's life. The cycle of manipulation and control was being perpetuated across generations, ensuring that Elizabeth would never be able to break free from her mother's psychological dominance. As Elizabeth read through 60 years of her mother's secret thoughts, she began to understand that virtually every major decision in her life had been influenced by Sara's manipulations. Her marriages, her career choices, her financial decisions, even her struggles with addiction. All of it could be traced back to her mother's systematic psychological manipulation. The most devastating entries dealt with Elizabeth's famous marriages, particularly her relationships with Richard Burton. Sara's diary revealed that she had actively interfered in these relationships, not to protect Elizabeth, but to maintain control over her daughter's emotional state and financial resources. Elizabeth thinks she loves Richard, but what she really loves is the feeling of being desired by someone she can't control. I've encouraged this relationship because Richard's drinking and volatility keep Elizabeth emotionally unstable and dependent on my guidance. A happy, stable marriage would threaten my influence over her decisions. Sara had deliberately encouraged Elizabeth's most destructive romantic relationships while sabotaging the healthy ones. She had recognized that Elizabeth's tumultuous marriage to Richard Burton kept her daughter emotionally dependent and financially vulnerable, making it easier to maintain control over her career and personal decisions. Richard called me today asking for advice about Elizabeth's medication. I suggested he might want to be more understanding of her needs, that sometimes she requires chemical assistance to cope with the pressures of their relationship. He doesn't realize that I'm the one who ensures she always has access to those medications. Sara had been actively enabling Elizabeth's prescription drug dependency, not just in her youth but throughout her adult life. She had maintained relationships with doctors and pharmacists who would provide Elizabeth with medications without proper oversight, ensuring that her daughter remained chemically dependent and psychologically vulnerable. The woman Elizabeth had loved and trusted more than anyone else in the world had been her greatest enemy, her most dangerous predator. Sara Taylor had used her daughter's love and trust to exploit her sexually, financially, and emotionally for decades, all while maintaining the facade of a loving, protective mother. The final entries in the diary, written just months before Sara's death, showed no remorse, no regret for the damage she had inflicted on her daughter. Elizabeth still doesn't know the full extent of what I did to secure her success. She believes her career was built on talent and luck. It's better that she never learns the truth about the sacrifices that were made, the arrangements that were necessary. She's always been too emotional, too sensitive to handle reality. Sara had taken her secrets to the grave, believing that Elizabeth was better off never knowing how completely she had been betrayed by the person she trusted most. But the diary revealed everything, 60 years of calculated exploitation disguised as maternal love. Elizabeth Taylor sat alone in her mother's bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a woman she now realized she had never truly known. The loving, protective mother she remembered was a fiction, a carefully constructed persona designed to hide a calculating predator who had systematically destroyed her daughter's autonomy, her innocence, and her ability to trust. The success Elizabeth had achieved, the fame and fortune that defined her public life, had been built on a foundation of manipulation, exploitation, and betrayal. Every triumph had been tainted by the knowledge that her mother had sold her dignity and her childhood to create the Elizabeth Taylor the world knew and loved. The diary explained so much about Elizabeth's lifelong struggles. The difficulty forming lasting relationships, the problems with trust, the dependence on medication, the feeling that she was never truly in control of her own life. All of it traced back to a mother who had programmed her from childhood to be exploitable, controllable, and dependent. Sara Taylor had created the perfect victim in her own daughter, then spent 60 years profiting from that victimization while maintaining the pretense of love and protection. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just what Sara had done to Elizabeth, it was that she had convinced Elizabeth to be grateful for it, to see it as evidence of maternal devotion rather than predatory exploitation. As Elizabeth closed the diary and sat in the gathering darkness of her mother's bedroom, she realized that she would have to reconstruct her entire understanding of her life, her relationships, and her identity. Everything she thought she knew about herself had been built on lies told by the person she loved most. The woman who had given her life had also stolen it, piece by piece, year by year, until nothing remained of Elizabeth's authentic self. Sara Taylor's greatest achievement wasn't launching her daughter's career, it was erasing her daughter's ability to exist independently of the manipulation that had shaped every moment of her existence. Elizabeth Taylor had finally learned the truth about her mother, but that truth came too late to change anything. Sara was dead, the damage was permanent, and Elizabeth was left to spend her remaining years trying to understand who she might have been if she had been allowed to make her own choices, form her own relationships, and live her own life. The secret diary had revealed the devastating truth: Elizabeth Taylor had never belonged to herself. She had always belonged to her mother, and her mother had sold her to the highest bidder while convincing her it was love.